I've been driving for the past 2 hours to the Marriott in Baltimore, where my wife is attending a conference. The plan was to surprise her by dropping in and taking her out for dinner. Yeah, right. Over the last 3 months, I've had suspicions that my wife, Megan, might be having an affair with a coworker. Every time she went on a business trip, training session, or conference, it seemed she was getting back later than expected. Tonight, I aimed to catch her in the act and bring it all to an end. Megan and I have been married for 14 years, with 2 beautiful children, 12, Sarah is 10 years old. Todd, 10, is currently staying with my mother. We got married right out of high school after dating for 2 years. Megan, with her long brown hair, slender figure, and strong facial features, was always bright and cheerful until about 3 months ago. I thought we had a strong marriage, but little things made me uneasy. I hesitated to confront her, fearing I'd appear paranoid or jealous. The conference that day was conveniently close, giving me the chance to drop in unexpectedly and potentially catch her in the act at the hotel counter. I handed over my suit bag and introduced myself as my wife, Megan, was at the insurance conference in room 214, and she told me I could pick up a key there. After confirming who I was, the clerk gave me the key, and I nervously made my way to the elevator. I had a million questions about what to do when I got there. Megan was in the conference room on the 2nd floor, and she told me I could pick up a key there. After confirming who I was, the guy at the desk gave me the key. I was pretty nervous and made my way to the elevator. I had a lot of questions running through my mind, like how to handle the situation, whether to knock or just walk in, and if she would be alone with the safety latch on. As I walked down the hall, I decided to use the key to unlock the door and see what would happen next. I tried to be quiet as I unlocked the door and opened it. I found Megan at a desk with I taught her how to approach the situation, whether to knock or walk in, and if she would be alone with the safety latch on as I walked down the hall. I decided to use the key to open the door and see what happened next. Trying to be quiet, I unlocked the door and swung it open. I found Megan at a desk with her briefcase open, doing paperwork. She turned around with a gasp and expressed surprise at my unexpected presence. I explained that I had some spare time and thought I would drop in to take her to dinner. Megan welcomed the idea and assumed I would be staying the night, expressing a desire for some company. Walking over, she gave me a big kiss. Realizing that my plan to catch her cheating had failed, I jokingly inquired about having a quick moment before dinner. Megan suggested a carnal gesture before her shower, promising a night of whatever I wanted. I was relieved that my suspicions had been confirmed. I was relieved I hadn't lost the woman I loved. We had a brief sexual encounter, and with a big grin, Megan headed into the bathroom for her shower. I gathered myself and took a seat on the bed. Megan's toiletry case sat on the dresser, prompting me to check for aspirin to alleviate my headache. I was relieved when I realized the rumors were baseless. I wasn't about to jump to any conclusions about my wife's infidelity. Instead, I looked through her makeup bag and found safety pins. I used them to poke a hole in each of the contraceptives and replaced them with some I found in her bag. I did this while Megan was still in the bathroom. After we had a quickie, Megan headed into the bathroom for her shower. I collected myself and plopped down on the bed. I looked over Megan's makeup bag and found a pack of 6 contraceptives in the side pocket. I pulled one out and sat on the bed. After Todd was born, Megan switched to birth control pills that made her queasy. This led to I had a vasectomy after my wife Megan started taking birth control pills, which made her nauseous. We stopped taking birth control and started enjoying life without it. Then, I found a pack of 6 condoms in her toiletry case. I'm not going to jump to conclusions about my wife cheating on me, but I was confused. I didn't know what to do next, so I started looking through her case. I found some safety pins that she kept for emergencies. I took one and carefully punctured a hole through the middle of each condom. I replaced them as I found them while Megan was still in the shower. I called a friend at home and asked him to do a. I asked him to wait about an hour and then call me on my cell. I explained that a pipe had burst at the school and that I needed to return urgently. I assured him that he just needed to make the call, as I would handle the rest. Freddie agreed and promised to call around 7. I decided I didn't want to spend the night with my wife. I regretted our previous actions and wished to avoid further complications. I would ponder on the drive home, aware that I had to take some action, though uncertain about what. As Megan emerged from the shower, I had a hard time not getting mad at her for being all hot and bothered. I'm usually pretty chill, but I figured it'd be better not to let her know about how I knew she was cheating on me. By the time we got to I was pretty bummed by the time we got to the dining room. I told Megan she could order whatever she wanted, since it was on me. She said she wasn't too hungry and ordered a small fillet, and then asked for a bottle of rose to go with it. After we placed the order, I couldn't resist asking Megan a few things. I asked Megan if she was happy with our marriage. She said yes. She said she had a nice home, 2 great kids, and a husband who loved her. She said she couldn't ask for more. I told her I sometimes wondered if I was doing everything to keep her happy. I told her how I felt. I told her how lucky I was to have such a great wife and that I had to pinch myself to believe it was real. Megan told me I was a silly goose and that's why I drove all the way down to see her. She said she didn't think I had anything to worry about because she was happy. She said I was doing all the right things, and that a woman couldn't ask for a better husband. Our dinners arrived, and we chatted during the meal. As plates were cleared, my cell phone rang. I excused myself to the lobby to avoid disturbing other diners and waited a few minutes before returning. I explained that my friend Freddie had called to tell me about a water pipe breaking at the school. I apologized and said I really had to get back there as soon as I could, which resulted in the cancellation of our planned night together. Megan's face showed a look of disappointment, but I couldn't tell if she was being genuine. It seemed like whether I stayed or left didn't matter to her. Either way, she was going to face consequences. While we were boarding the elevator, Kirk Langford got off and greeted Megan. He said he stopped by the room for dinner but she didn't answer. He shook her hand, said his name, and told her that Megan talks about him all the time. I told him I'd come down for the night but had to go back because of an emergency and it was hard to. I told him that I'd stopped by her room for dinner, but she didn't answer. I said my name, Kirk Langford, and that Megan talks about me all the time. I explained that I'd come for the night, but I had to go back because of an emergency. It was hard to shake hands and smile, but we did it. When we got in the elevator, I talked about the problem again with Megan. I said that I wanted her to quit her job, and that I didn't like it that she works with Kirk. I told her that we'd talked about this before, and it was important to me. Megan said, we shook hands and smiled at each other on the way up in the elevator. I told Megan again that I didn't like Kirk, and that I didn't want her to quit her job. I told her that we had talked about this before, and that it was really important to me. She said that she wasn't planning on quitting, that she liked her job and was learning a lot from Kirk. She said that I needed to stop worrying about Kirk and her. After a quick kiss, I picked up my bags and left for the trip home. On the way, I couldn't stop thinking about Kirk. I couldn't stop thinking about Kirk. I made a stop by Megan's room after dinner, and by the time I got back, I was a mess. I was so angry at my wife. I wished I could catch cheating spouses, but I was clueless. I couldn't even figure out how to avoid getting close to her. I was a mess when I got back to my house after dinner. I couldn't stand my wife, and I wished I could catch cheating spouses, but I was clueless. I couldn't even figure out how to avoid getting close to her. I really wanted my wife to get a divorce, but I didn't have enough evidence, so I was defeated. My wife was unfaithful, and I knew it, but I couldn't do anything. I didn't want to deal with it, so I looked for help. 2 days later, Megan came home with a happy attitude, which made me even more angry. When I checked her bag, I found one. I really wanted to get a divorce, but I didn't have enough evidence. My wife was unfaithful, and I knew it, but I couldn't do anything about it. I didn't want to deal with it, so I got help. 2 days later, Megan came home, and she was happy about it, which made me even more annoyed. When I checked her bag, I found a condom. On Saturday, we had the Globies Insurance Company picnic, which the kids enjoyed. I wasn't looking forward to the day, because I thought some of my colleagues knew about the situation. I felt a little exposed, like I was trying to hide to avoid people making rude jokes. Maybe I was a little paranoid, but I couldn't help it. Megan had fun socializing with Kirk and others, and even though they weren't doing anything wrong, they were definitely close. I was fine with being ignored. Someone named Janet Langford introduced herself. She said she thought I was Phil Jenkins. She was stunning, and I was honestly confused. I thought highly of my wife and loved her. Janet Langford looked like a pin-up model with long auburn hair and big blue eyes. She was a little short, but her perfect body left me wondering. Janet Langford was stunning. I thought highly of my wife and loved her, but I was also confused. She looked like a pin-up model with long auburn hair and big blue eyes. She was a little short, but her perfect body made me wonder why Kirk would cheat on someone like her. After we exchanged pleasantries, we agreed to find a quieter place to talk. We settled on some benches about 100 yards from the picnic area, sitting by the lake. I offered to listen to whatever Janet wanted to discuss. She hesitated, expressing difficulty in why would Kirk cheat on someone like her after they'd already exchanged pleasantries. We decided to find a quieter place to talk, and we ended up sitting on some benches about 100 yards from the picnic area by the lake. I said I'd listen to whatever Janet wanted to discuss. She hesitated, and said she was having a hard time talking about a sensitive subject. I figured she knew about the affair, so I decided to make it easier for her by mentioning that I'd just found out about it that week. Janet seemed relieved, and said she'd known for about 2 months. She explained her plans to have divorce papers served, and said she'd hired a detective to gather proof. Her lawyer had told her that Megan's willingness to testify or sign a notarized statement about the affair would strengthen her case. I asked about the type of proof, and Janet mentioned having photos and taped phone conversations. She didn't have any videos yet, but she thought the photos were convincing. She also had times and dates that could be used as evidence. Janet said she was willing to work on it and asked if my lawyer could help her with the same divorce papers using some of the evidence I had. She said she didn't have any proof and that she'd appreciate any help I could give her. I'm also taking legal action against Globes. I have statements from specific company officials at that management level. She said the photos were compelling, even if she didn't have any videos yet. She also had times and dates that could be used as evidence. Janet said she was willing to work on it and asked if my lawyer could help her with the same divorce papers using some of the evidence I had. She said she didn't have much proof and that she was thankful for any help I could give. I'm also taking legal action against Globes. I have statements from company officials at the management level who knew about the affair and didn't do anything to stop it. They have to choose, fire both people involved or face a $1 million lawsuit. Impressive, right? Kirk is playing golf tomorrow morning. Can you come over to the house around noon? You should be gone until late afternoon. I can show you what I have, and we can figure out if there's anything we can do. I live at 26 Hemlock Avenue in Crestmont. It's a plan, not really a date, but you know what I mean. We both laughed a little. I felt that we strolled back up to the picnic area, and no one seemed to notice we weren't there. I felt a lot better about things, and maybe this whole mess could get worked out. I sure hope so. As expected, Megan told me the next morning that she had some shopping to do and would be gone for a couple of hours. After she left, I dropped the kids off at my mom's and headed to Crestmont. Janet greeted me at the door, and we went into the den. There was a nice leather couch in the room, and on the table in front of it was a big computer monitor. She showed me a picture of an empty motel room and told me to sit down. She offered me beer, soda, and wine, but I only took the soda, Pepsi. I asked Janet what was going on, and she said that in a few minutes, we'd be watching her husband play a round of golf live and in full color. She thought I might know the guy working with Kirk. When I asked how she set this up, Janet said it cost her $1,400, and Kirk would cover it. She thought the session was going to be about 2 hours, so she told me to get comfy. She said she'd have popcorn and nachos, and she'd get a DVD of the whole thing. She said she'd give me a copy, and she admitted she wasn't really interested in watching, but she didn't want to miss it either. We talked for about 20 minutes before we got started, and Janet told me everything she'd found out about the affair, including the photos, tapes, and documents. The session was supposed to last about 2 hours, so she told me to get comfy. She said she'd have popcorn and nachos, and she'd get a DVD of the whole thing. She said she wasn't really into watching, but she'd give me a copy. She also said she wouldn't miss it, but she was kind of into it. We talked for about 20 minutes, and Janet told me all the stuff she found out about the affair, like photos, tapes, and documents. The stuff she told me left me pretty amazed and upset, 'cause it showed that Megan was doing something wrong. Then Janet said there were 3 big koi fish in the backyard. I said I'd like to bring the kids over to see them, and she seemed happy about it. Just then, the monitor showed activity, and like Janet said, Kirk and Megan came in the room right away, taking off their clothes without saying anything or doing anything first. The video was clear, but the sound was a little garbled. I felt weird watching my wife and her husband doing that. The info she gave me was pretty mind-blowing, and it was a bit of a shocker. Janet said she had 3 huge koi fish in her backyard, and I told her I'd love to bring the kids over to see them. She seemed into the idea. Then, the monitor lit up, and just like Janet, Kirk and Megan walked right in, no chit-chat or anything. The video was pretty clear, but the sound was a bit messed up. I was kind of weirded out watching my wife and her husband getting it on with a stranger on the couch. Janet said, "Wow, you don't see a body like that very often." I smiled, but I had no clue how to respond. Honestly, watching my wife in that situation had me totally speechless. The more we watched, the more uncomfortable it got. I finally told Janet how weird it was feeling, and if we had to keep watching. She said she wasn't really into it, and we decided to call it a night. Janet said, "Wow, you don't see a body like that very often." I smiled, but I didn't know how to respond. In fact, watching my wife in that situation left me speechless. The experience became increasingly uncomfortable. I finally addressed Janet, expressing my discomfort and asking if we had to watch all of it. I assumed she wasn't interested in continuing to watch either. Janet confirmed that she wasn't really interested, and we decided to discontinue the viewing. To be honest, witnessing my wife engage in carnal activities with another man is somewhat unpleasant, and I feel a bit uneasy watching it with you beside me. However, the entire event is being recorded, which is all we need for the lawyers, and we don't necessarily have to watch it. I can't say I derive any enjoyment from it, and the plot seems quite predictable. Are you planning to head home or something? Well, actually, I was hoping you could show me your koi ponds. I think that would be much more interesting. After about 2 hours of hard work, her eyes lit up when I showed interest in her hobby. As we walked to the back of the house, Megan had her first orgasm, and I couldn't help but think that I was going to have a more enjoyable afternoon than my wife. The 3 fish ponds were fantastic, and I was particularly intrigued by the pumping and filter systems, given my background as a plumber before working at the school. Kirk didn't help her with her hobby at all, and she had to hire people to do pipe work. I offered to help her out with the pump work whenever Kirk was playing golf. I had no romantic intentions, I just wanted to learn more about the koi ponds. It was nice spending time with her. After a few hours, we went back to the house. The motel room was empty, so it was time for me to head home. Janet promised to call when Kirk had another golf game, so I could visit with Sarah and Todd. The next few weeks were rough. Every time Megan took a shower, I checked her bag to see if she had a new supply. I couldn't imagine using contraceptives when she finally had time to use them all. I kept a safety pin on my keychain, ready to puncture them any day now. I figured Megan might have to make a surprise visit to her sister on evenings after Kirk's golf games. The kids would excitedly recount their visit to the koi lady, showing Megan pictures of the fish they drew and sharing the names they gave them. She never connected Kirk's wife to the koi lady and seemed relieved that I could keep the kids occupied while she was busy, so I tried twice more to get her to quit her job and stop seeing Kirk. Both times, she said no. The second time, she was especially mean. I also started making excuses to avoid being close to her, and she started making fun of my masculinity. It stung a bit, but it made everything I was doing easier to justify. Finally, on a Tuesday night, she dropped a bombshell. She'd been feeling really stressed lately. Megan suggested she was otherwise engaged. I tried to persuade her to quit her job and stop seeing Kirk 2 more times. I got the same rejection both times, and the second one was particularly unpleasant. I also started making excuses to avoid being close to her, and she responded with digs about my masculinity. It stung a bit, but it made everything I was doing easier to justify. Finally, on a Tuesday night, she dropped a bombshell. She'd been feeling really stressed lately. Megan suggested taking a few days off from work to visit her sister for about a week. She acknowledged my efforts with overtime and late nights and thought it would be a good idea for me to relax while she was away. Megan believed that a trip to my sister would be much better than spending a year with a shrink. She encouraged me to have a good time, assuring that she would take care of everything. Megan was glad that I understood the necessity of the extra work for the good of the family, but expressed a concern that I might have overdo it. I had a hard time sleeping that night, thinking about everything I had to do the next day. I was glad it finally happened. Megan's sister Nancy and her husband Brad lived about 3 hours away. Brad was an okay guy, but he could be a real idiot, especially when Nancy was in charge. Interestingly, their town had 2 termination clinics, and I had gathered the names, addresses, and operating hours for both. I even looked at the terms of agreement required for services at each. I had a tough night, thinking about everything I had to do the next day. I was glad it finally happened. Megan's sister Nancy and her husband Brad lived about 3 hours away. Brad was an okay guy, but he could be a real idiot, especially when Nancy was in charge. Interestingly, their town had 2 termination clinics, and I had gathered the names, addresses, and operating hours for both. I even familiarized myself with the terms of agreement required for services at each clinic. Noted the 2-day cooling-off period. They both mandated a 2-day waiting period. Assuming Megan's first appointment was on Wednesday, the earliest she could schedule the procedure was Friday, giving her a few recovery days before returning home. This provided me with a day and a half to finalize my plans, which seemed manageable. After Megan embarked on her rest and recuperation trip, I began making preparations. I had to explain the situation to my parents, acknowledging my failure as a husband. They understood and offered their supportive. The kids are having fun with my parents, and Dad's truck is useful for moving Megan's stuff. The lawyers got all the paperwork ready Thursday morning. Janet's paperwork is ready too, and she's planning to serve Kirk at the same time as me, serving Megan. The only internal struggle I had was deciding whether to give Megan one last chance to make amends, though I didn't have much hope. Dad and I spent the rest of the day packing Megan's things. On Thursday morning, after a 3, I was in the car for an hour on my way to the first clinic, but I ended up being disappointed. That left me with one more option, the Family Planning Center. I went up to the receptionist and explained that I was Phil Jenkins and that my wife Megan had told me to come sign a consensual agreement form. When the receptionist asked about the form specifics, I said I didn't know the exact name, but I mentioned I made it to the first clinic, but they weren't helpful at all. So, I went to the Family Planning Center. I told the receptionist that I was Phil Jenkins and that my wife, Megan, had told me to come sign a consent form. When the receptionist asked about the form, I said I didn't know the exact name, but it was a form saying I understood everything and wouldn't sue. The receptionist confirmed Megan's identity and said that her sister had signed for her, but that my signature would be better. She checked the computer for a few seconds and then got the file. I took the chance and signed the form right below Megan's. I noticed that the procedure was scheduled for Friday morning at 11:00 a.m. I had to be there an hour early, so I asked about any remaining payments. I took out my checkbook and put it on the counter. The receptionist said Megan had already paid the full amount of $800 in cash, and there was nothing else to do at that time. I thanked her for her help and said it made the process a lot easier. When I arrived at Nancy and Brad's, the reception was really insincere. Megan started There was some conversation about how surprised they were to see me there, and they asked what I was doing there. I told them that Mom and Dad wanted to keep the kids for a few days, so I took some sick leave and decided to visit them. I also said that I needed to unwind a little. The room got a little quiet, and I could tell everyone was thinking hard. I had put them in a tough spot, and now they had to find a way out of it. I saw Nancy nod to Brad, telling him to go with her to the kitchen. Megan and I talked about different things for a few minutes. Then Brad came back into the room with a suggestion. He said we should take the day off, borrow his buddy Jack's boat, and spend the day on the lake so we wouldn't bother the ladies. I agreed, saying that a day drifting on the lake would be great. Nancy nodded to Brad, telling him to follow her to the kitchen. Megan and I talked for a few minutes, switching topics like we usually did. Then Brad came back with a suggestion. He said we should take the day off, so we could borrow his buddy Jack's boat and spend the day on the lake. That way, we wouldn't bother the ladies. I agreed. I said a day drifting on the lake would make all my worries disappear. I suggested checking if Jack could join us, and Brad agreed to get everything set up. Everyone seemed relieved with how things unfolded. We had an uneventful dinner and spent the rest of the evening chatting about various topics. However, there was no closeness that night, as Megan didn't want her sister to overhear. The next morning, Jack was waiting with the boat, and Brad prepared lunch while stocking. My worries disappeared. I suggested checking if Jack could join us, and Brad agreed to get everything set up. Everyone seemed relieved with how things unfolded. We had an uneventful dinner and spent the rest of the evening chatting about various topics. However, there was no closeness that night, as Megan didn't want her sister to overhear. The next morning, Jack was waiting with the boat, and Brad prepared lunch while stocking the cooler with beer. We engaged in conversation while loading the truck. In the boat, Brad asked if I was getting into the truck, as I stood by the passenger's door. I informed him that I had decided not to go and suggested that he make the most of the day because facing Nancy for the next few hours wouldn't be pleasant. Brad spent about 5 minutes trying to persuade me to go, but I had to get firm after a couple of I was chatting with my dad on the phone when I got a call from Brad. He was at the boat, and he asked if I was going to go with him. I told him I wasn't, and he said he should go without me. He said he was going to have to talk to Nancy, and he didn't think it would be nice. He tried to convince me to go with him for about 5 minutes, but I told him no. He started swearing at me, and he even said he was going to hit me. Jack and Brad left, and I went inside and got a coffee. I turned off Nancy's phone, and then I called my dad. He was up early, and we talked for about 2 hours. We ignored the call waiting tones. Brad must have tried to reach Nancy for hours, and Nancy and Megan got. I made a fresh pot of coffee and let them know I was heading out. Jack and Brad were already gone, swearing and making threats. I called my dad, who was always up early. We chatted for about 2 hours, ignoring the constant call waiting tones. Brad must have been trying to reach Nancy for hours, as Nancy and Megan got up. I said goodbye to my dad and braced for the impending confrontation. I cleared the missed calls on the landline and turned Nancy's cell phone back on. In less than 2 hours, Megan and Nancy needed to be at the family planning center. I would face 2 furious women in about 5 minutes. I finished the first pot of coffee, so I brewed a new one for my wife and her sister. Megan exclaimed, questioning why I was there. I explained that I wasn't in the mood for fishing, so I decided to stick around with them for the day. I suggested finding a nice place for lunch together, mentioning that I had to leave that night and didn't want to spend the day. I made a new one for my wife, and Megan said, "What's up with you not wanting to fish?" I said I wasn't in the mood for it, so I was just going to stick around with them for the day. I said we could find a nice place for lunch, but I had to leave that night and didn't want to spend the day with Brad and Jack. Megan said she and Nancy had plans for the day and wanted to go by themselves. She said she could go out with me any time, but she only got to see Nancy a couple of times a year. She also said I'd be there all week. I tried to convince her, but she wouldn't change her mind. Megan said she didn't want me to come with them because she and Nancy had plans. She said she could go out with me any time, but she only got to see Nancy a couple of times a year. She also said I'd be there all week. I tried to convince her that I could spare at least half a day, since I had driven all the way there. I suggested she could have the rest of the week for her sisterly activities. Nancy left the room, dialing a number on her cell phone. Megan sat in a chair, looking defeated, as if she'd been hit by a truck. We could hear Nancy. Megan said she could spare me at least half a day since I'd driven all the way down there. I told her she could have the rest of the week for her sisterly activities. Nancy left the room, dialing a number on her cell phone. Megan sat in a chair, looking defeated, as if she'd been hit by a truck. We could hear Nancy screaming at Brad over the phone, as if he'd committed the crime of the century. I felt sorry for the guy, but he'd married her. Megan said she and Nancy didn't want me tagging along for the day, emphasizing that they had their plans and I wasn't part of them. I agreed to hear their plans for the day and decide whether to go along. I was interested or would find something else to do. I was confused about the situation since they had the entire week and I only had that day. I jokingly asked if they were meeting some guys, and Megan clarified that they weren't meeting any guys, but planned to do some shopping for carnal items like bras. I said I was interested or I'd find something else to do. I was confused about the situation since they had the whole week and I only had that day. I jokingly asked if they were meeting some guys. Megan said they weren't meeting any guys, but they were planning to go shopping for things like bras, underwear, and sexy nightgowns. She explained that these were items they didn't want guys around gawking at while they were trying them on. I said that most of those shops were in the mall and I could keep myself busy doing other things while they used the dressing rooms. I offered to tag along and stay out of their way. I told them not to worry about keeping me entertained during lunch, and I offered to take them somewhere nice instead. Nancy stood in the doorway, glaring at me, but didn't say anything. Megan could see that I wasn't going to be reasoned with, and she seemed she was ready to give up. Both were still in their house coats, and eventually Megan stood up and said she had to go get dressed and left the room. Nancy looked at me and called me a real bonehead before following Megan upstairs. About 20 minutes later, the light on the landline phone lit up, indicating someone upstairs. It was time to make a move. The clock was ticking, and they had an hour to get to the center. I thought about my next step if they tried to leave without me. I was planning to follow them and make sure they knew it. But I didn't think they would try that. After 20 minutes, both of them came down the stairs. Megan told me that I was on the phone. The clock was ticking, and they had an hour to get to the center. I thought about my next move if they tried to leave without me, planning to follow them and make sure they knew it. But I didn't think they would do that. After 20 minutes, they both came down the stairs. Megan told me that it was time to go shopping. I added a bit of an attitude. Surprisingly, it was a bit easier than I thought it would be. Thought the upstairs phone call was probably to the family planning center, maybe to reschedule the appointment, since I said I was leaving that night. They probably figured the best way around the problem was to do it that way. It was time to go shopping, and I was pretty relaxed about it. I figured the upstairs phone call was probably to the family planning center, maybe to reschedule the appointment, since I said I was leaving that night. I guess they figured the best way around the problem was to just wait until I left. I wasn't trying to stop Megan from getting the termination, but I wanted to make it more difficult for her. I insisted on taking my car because I wanted to drive. I didn't want them ditching me somewhere a few miles from the house. I pulled into a service station and filled up the gas tank. I told them I was just waiting for my appointment, but I wanted to make it more difficult for her. I insisted on taking my car because I wanted to drive. I didn't want them ditching me somewhere a few miles from the house. I pulled into a service station, filled up the gas tank, checked the oil and water, and cleaned the windshield. It was the most time I ever spent servicing my car. They both just sat fuming when we arrived at the mall. I parked far out so we'd have a good walk. Once we were in the mall, I pretty much left them alone. I kept an eye on them, but I really didn't care about what they were doing. They didn't seem to be having much fun, to be honest. They spent most of the time talking to each other and making gestures. They bought a few things, just to show me they had been shopping. I tried to stay hidden but still keep an eye on them. There was definitely some serious discussion going on. The time for the appointment was definitely up. I had succeeded in delaying the inevitable. I knew she was still going to get the procedure, so I had no intention of interfering any further. Shortly after, they came back to the center court of the mall, where I said I would meet them. We went to the Olive Garden for lunch and got back to the house around 2:00 p.m. I passed, so I had succeeded in delaying the inevitable. I knew she was still going to get the procedure, so I had no intention of interfering any further. Later that afternoon, they came back to the center court of the mall, where I said I would meet them. We went to the Olive Garden for lunch and got back to the house around 2:00 p.m. There wasn't much conversation during lunch or on the drive home. I was smiling to myself the whole time. I knew these two were upset with me right now, and I didn't care. What a wonderful feeling. I grabbed a beer and relaxed on the sofa. Brad finally arrived, and for about 30 minutes, Nancy verbally berated him. He managed to slip, bowed, and disappeared for a couple of hours, returning by supper time, after the girls finished cleaning up. I requested a private conversation with Megan in the kitchen. Nancy sneered, and they both went into the living room. Megan remained upset due to the earlier events. I could tell she was going to be a handful. I got straight to the point, telling her she should quit her job and stop seeing Kirk Langford. Her teeth were clenched tight, and she was really trying not to hit me. She kept insisting that she didn't want to hear that again. She was frustrated with me for bringing it up again and again. Megan refused to waste her time answering me, saying that I already knew the answer and it wouldn't change. She gave me an ultimatum: either change the topic or leave. I reached into the manila envelope by the chair and pulled out a legal-sized envelope. I explained that I had asked her at least 10 times in the last 2 months and each time she refused. I presented the divorce papers and suggested she sign them and mail them in. I mentioned that there was a self. I showed her the envelope, which was addressed and stamped. I told her she could have a lawyer look it over if she wanted. She glared at me and leaned across the table, clearly frustrated. She said I couldn't divorce her just because she wouldn't quit her job or have the friends I wanted her to have. Megan insisted that for a divorce, there needed to be grounds, and I didn't have any. She said it was time for me to go home and get my act together. She said she was my wife and didn't plan on giving up her home and family just because I didn't like her job. I responded by reaching into my manila envelope and pulling out a stack of photos. I put 6 pictures of Megan with Kirk on the table and asked if she had been making love with him. There was no answer as I put another 6 pictures of them in various positions on the table. She said she was my wife and didn't plan on giving up her home and family just because I didn't like where she worked. I took out a stack of photos from my manila envelope and put 6 pictures of Megan and Kirk on the table. I asked if she had been making love with him there. There was no answer. I put more pictures on the table. The table. She started screaming at me, urging me to stop. I acknowledged her reaction, understanding that she thought I was spying. She criticized me, calling me a sneaky person and saying she didn't like my approach. She questioned why I didn't address the situation directly and accused me of behaving like a pervert, saying that my complaining made her sick. At that moment, my cell phone rang. I answered it, learning that my dad with the table started screaming at me, telling me to stop. I knew she thought I was spying, so I told her I understood. She said I was sneaky and that she didn't like how I acted. She asked why I didn't just talk to her about it, and said I was being a pervert. Then my phone rang, and it was my dad. He was bringing Megan's stuff to Nancy's place, and he was going to pick me up in 10 minutes. When I got off the phone, she asked about the call. I told her my dad was bringing her stuff to my place, and I explained that the locks had been changed at our house. I said I'd be happy to get anything she forgot, but she didn't say anything. I gave her the title to her car, and I told her I'd sign it over to her in an envelope. I gave her half of the money from our bank accounts, which was about $200. I told her she could visit, but only if she followed some rules. I was seeing the kids once a week, and there was a possibility of an overnight stay once a month. If she made a statement about the affair and had it notarized, I added that I had a DVD from the May 10th visit she and Kirk made to the Scandia Motel. It was 2 hours long and captured everything depicted in the pictures. As I collected the photos, I clarified that I hadn't taken any of these. I wasn't concerned about your activities, I just didn't appreciate being deceived. Lastly, I'd like you to have this keepsake from our love. I took the safety pin from my keychain and slid it across the table. I told Megan I'd been using it to poke holes in all of our contraceptives for the past 2 months. I mentioned that she'd used 48 rubbers in the last 2 weeks alone, and Kirk had been more fortunate than I ever dreamed of being. She got angry and called me a miserable weasel, saying my actions were the most despicable thing she'd ever heard of. I retorted, saying the most despicable thing was having an affair with someone. I admitted that I might be a fool outside of our marriage, but she was a cheating partner. I told her I had to run because my dad had just pulled up in the driveway. She never apologized or expressed remorse for her actions. As I left, I said goodbye and wished her well with her termination. On Monday, she finally started crying as I left the room. Nancy rushed in to comfort her, and Brad followed me out to the front porch. Brad questioned my actions, saying that I couldn't throw away a 14, after a misunderstanding. My marriage ended after 3 years. I asked him why my wife had come to visit him and Nancy. Brad looked down at his feet for a few seconds, seemingly thinking. Eventually, he apologized and offered to help me unload the truck. We finished in about 10 minutes, while Megan continued crying in the kitchen. I didn't know what she was crying about, and frankly, I didn't care. Kirk and Megan were both fired from Globies the next day. We got married a year ago, but we didn't get along. I asked him why my wife came to visit him and Nancy. Brad looked down at his feet for a few seconds, as if he was thinking. Eventually, he apologized and offered to help me unload the truck. We finished in about 10 minutes, while Megan continued crying in the kitchen. I didn't know why she was crying, and I didn't care. Kirk and Megan were both fired from Globies the next week. Megan refused to sign an affidavit. The lawyer said he had a strong enough case without it. I didn't hear from my wife at all after that night. She didn't come to see the kids, and they didn't seem to miss her because they were getting along well with Janet. We spent a lot of time together as a family, mostly. There was no romance or even talk of it. We weren't going to do anything that might jeopardize the divorces. The kids and I were learning. We finally had a great time with Coy after 4 months. Both divorces were final. Megan never fought hers, but Kirk did. He lost the house, all the investments, and ended up having to pay a large monthly alimony payment. A few days before Christmas, Megan came to the house with presents for the kids. I was polite and didn't do anything to ruin the holiday spirit. She stayed for about 2 hours and then left as quietly as we finally got to enjoy some quality time together after 4 long months. Megan never fought her divorce, but Kirk put up a fight. He lost the house, all the investments, and ended up having to pay a large monthly alimony payment. A few days before Christmas, Megan came to the house with presents for the kids. I was polite and didn't do anything to ruin the holiday spirit. She stayed for about 2 hours and then left as quietly as. We didn't talk about the divorce or the affair. I put the house up for sale, and 2 months later, we moved in with Janet. Kirk took a job in Omaha, and Megan went with him for a few months. Then, Kirk disappeared and didn't tell her where he was going. Megan moved back in with Nancy after Brad left for a job on the Alaskan pipeline. 2 months later, Nancy received divorce papers in the mail. The two sisters are good company for each other. Janet and I were comfortable with each other. She adores the kids, and they feel the same way about her. We're planning on getting married in June and spending every moment we can practicing for the honeymoon. We needed to have a serious conversation, no doubt about that. As I looked up at the woman who had been my wife for more than 2 decades, it was clear that the last few years had changed the dynamics between us. "It's over," she said, her voice strained. "We get along well. She really likes the kids, and they feel the same about her. We're planning on getting married in June and spending as much time as possible practicing for the honeymoon." Second story, we needed to have a serious conversation, no doubt about that. When I looked at the woman who had been my wife for over 20 years, it was clear that the last few years had changed the dynamics between us. "It's over," she said, her voice almost choking on the words. "Mike and I are no longer together." I nodded, offering my condolences, as she stood there, hands nervously twisting together. She went on to share that nearly 3 years had passed since she promised that things would return to normal. I gently probed for the reasons behind the breakup. Gwen, avoiding eye contact, mentioned my growing unhappiness over the past few months. She said familiarity had set in and the magic spark had vanished. I nodded and said I was sorry as she stood there, hands nervously twisting together. She said that almost 3 years had passed since she promised things would get back to normal. I asked her why they broke up, and she, avoiding eye contact, said I was unhappy for the last few months. She said we were too familiar, and the spark was gone. I couldn't help but remember a conversation from over 2 years ago when Gwen said our love-making life was becoming mundane and that she was having an affair with a younger, more vigorous man. She said she was going to keep the affair and that I could either accept it or risk losing her, our home, our kids, and my job working for her father. To top it off, she even threatened me with domestic abuse charges. I couldn't help but remember a conversation from over 2 years ago when Gwen dropped the bombshell about our love life becoming mundane and her taking a lover, a younger, more vigorous man. She made it clear that she intended to continue the affair, leaving me with an ultimatum: accept it or risk losing her, our home, our kids, and my job working for her father. To top it off, she even threatened me with domestic abuse charges. The memories flooded back, and the déjà vu was unsettling. Gwen reminded me that she had previously mentioned that the situation wouldn't last forever. She thanked me for my patience and understanding during that time. I responded with a nonchalant shrug, not offering much to the conversation. She continued outlining her plans for our future. She suggested that we could return to normal and I could move back into our bedroom whenever I wanted. She even proposed doing so right away. She started talking about how upset she was about Mike ending their relationship so suddenly, and I asked her about what he had said. Gwen started sobbing, and she told me that he had criticized her for aging and said that she had gained too much weight. He said he was unhappy about being seen with her and mentioned that he wanted someone younger in his life. I told her I understood, but I didn't want to disagree with Mike's judgment. I said I was a little reluctant to. I was hesitant to sleep in our bed again, considering how many times Gwen and Mike had used it. Gwen insisted that she never had Mike over when I was home, pointing out the times I was at work or away in France. She suggested getting rid of the old bed and buying a new one the next day. I jokingly mentioned that a new bed might be nice, and we had an awkward silence. Eventually, Gwen enthusiastically promised to make it up to me, acknowledging that we hadn't been intimate for over 2 years. She said things could easily go back to how they used to be. I asked if it could really be the same, and Gwen, feeling more confident, said it could. She was optimistic about us getting back to how things used to be. I asked if we could pick up where we left off, considering the embarrassment I faced in front of our family and friends. I mentioned how I stopped going to the village pub too. Gwen said that things could easily go back to how they were, and I asked if she really thought they could. She seemed hopeful, and I asked if we could get back to how things were. I said that I didn't want to go to the village pub anymore because I felt embarrassed, and I knew Gwen and Mike went there a lot. Gwen said she was sorry and that she might have been thoughtless, and she said that everyone knew about her affair with Mike. She also said that my comments about Mike's bed skills compared to mine made things worse. I told her about the hurtful comments their friends made to me, and she said that Mike wasn't better, but just different and more exciting. I told Gwen I didn't want to go back to our bedroom life, because it would hurt my male ego. I said I didn't want to go back to how things were before, because it would be too hard. Gwen said that she didn't want to go back to how things were either. She said that she sold the Jaguar a year ago, and that I hadn't been paying attention to her. I told her that I sold the Jaguar a year ago, and that I didn't pay much attention to her either. I told her that I didn't want to go back to our old bedroom routine. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. He told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. He told her that I didn't want to go back to how things were, because it would be too hard. I told her that I didn't. She was shocked that I'd sold the car I'd spent so much time renovating. I told her we couldn't buy it back, and she suggested using money from the company or her trust to get another one. I said no, and asked where the money would come from. I told Gwen she'd signed away the trust money 5 months ago, explaining that the money was used for our kids' house deposits. She was stunned. She seemed surprised and asked where the money came from. I told her I had told her, including my decision to sell the Jaguar. I said she was preoccupied with her affair and the microphone at that time. Gwen asked about the family company's financial status, and I said the company was fine but no longer owned by us. She seemed clueless about the recent paperwork finalizing the deal. Desperate to understand our financial situation, she seemed surprised and asked where the money came from. I told her I'd told her, including that I sold the Jaguar. I said she was preoccupied with her affair and the microphone. Gwen asked about the family company's financial status, and I said the company was fine but not owned by us anymore. She seemed to not know about the recent paperwork finalizing the deal and really wanted to know about our financial situation. Gwen asked about the sale of the business and whether we were still rich. I let her stew for a while, letting her think about the changes that happened while she was busy with her affair with Mike. I then said her share from the sale of the business would just about cover the mortgage on the house. Confused, she asked about the mortgage, showing she didn't care about financial matters. I said I'd spent my half on a 45-ft sailing yacht, as I had taken early retirement and planned to spend my days sailing the seas. Gwen expressed her dismay, saying she hated boats and the sea. I acknowledged her feelings but emphasized that there was no room for her on the boat anyway. She demanded an explanation, wondering why there wasn't enough room for her on such a large boat. Seemingly reconsidering her dislike for the sea, I explained that the sailboat was designed for just 2 people, including the deckhand I hired recently. This, she insisted, was no problem. She said she could still come with me, and we could head to the Mediterranean or go sailing south to France. I told her about the one cabin on the boat, and she was surprised. She asked who the deckhand was. I told her the deckhand was a woman who had been sleeping with me for a while. When she found out that Giselle was a 28-year-old woman, she was shocked. Gwen, a 29-year-old French blonde, was skilled in boat knowledge, cooking, and passionate about carnal matters. The next day, I left for France to join my boat and Giselle, leaving Gwen still sobbing. It took some time, but my plan was coming to fruition. I hadn't informed Quinn about the 6-bedroom villa I had bought nearby with the money I had saved before selling the company. I was excited to enjoy the pool and playful moments with Susie, who always forgot to wear the top half of her bikini. I also looked forward to the joy of opening the garage doors where my old Jaguar XK140 had been sitting alone for too long. It would soon be taking. Giselle and I were excited to head to a French restaurant down the coast, and Mike was looking forward to a night out. Unfortunately, he ended up getting mugged outside his favorite bar. He suffered injuries like 5 broken ribs, busted kneecaps, and the loss of his purse and one of his testicles. It seemed like everything had changed for him.